The grand hall of the Hegemony Council shimmered with light from 1,000 floating crystals, and the gathered diplomats raised their glasses in celebration, as they had done every year for 3 centuries. Now Ambassador Vorthax of the Kelani Dominion stood at the center podium, his scales gleaming under the artificial suns that hung above the chamber, and his voice carried across the vast space as he addressed the representatives of the 12 most powerful species in the galaxy. 300 years ago, our ancestors made a difficult choice, he declared, his tone grave but proud. They saw a species rising too fast, growing too bold, reaching too far into the stars without the wisdom to wield such power. And they did what needed to be done. The crowd murmured in agreement, their various forms nodding and clicking and gesturing, approval in the ways of their different peoples. The humans were dangerous, Vorthax continued, not because they were strong, but because they refused to accept their place in the natural order of things. And so the hegemony of 12 united for the first and only time in our history to cleanse the galaxy of their threat. He raised his glass higher, the purple liquid inside catching the light like liquid amethyst. To the purge of soul, he announced, to the wisdom of our ancestors, and to 300 years of peace and prosperity. The hall erupted in cheers and the clinking of glasses against glasses, and species that had been rivals for millennia shared drinks and congratulations as, though they were the oldest of friends, in a far corner of the hall, a young Kalani female named Selah watched the celebration with something cold settling in her stomach, and she could not quite name the feeling that made her want to leave this place and never return. She was not supposed to be here at all, being merely a junior astronomer at the Nexus Prime Observatory, but her mentor had fallen ill, and she had been sent in his place to represent the scientific community at this grand event. The speeches continued for hours, each representative of the 12 taking their turn to praise the genocide of an entire species. And Selah found herself slipping out of the hall before the final toast was given. The night air of Paramount was cool against her scales as she walked through the gardens outside the council building, and she looked up at the stars that filled the sky like scattered diamonds somewhere out there. 300 years ago, a yellow sun had been turned into a weapon against the people who had orbited it, and 12 billion lives had ended in fire and screaming in darkness. She had read the old reports, the ones that were not supposed to be available to junior researchers, and she knew things that the celebrating diplomats inside either did not know or chose to forget. The humans had not started the war, and they had not been the aggressors that the official histories claimed them to be. They had simply been too successful, too innovative, too quick to advance from a single planet to a dozen colonies in barely 2 centuries. And the hegemony had seen them as a threat to be eliminated before they could grow any stronger. Selah returned to her work at Nexus Prime 3 days later, grateful to leave the politics of Paramount behind her. And she threw herself into her research with renewed dedication. Nexus Prime was a beautiful world, a trading hub where dozens of species came together to exchange goods and ideas and cultures. And its orbital stations handled more commerce than any other system in the known galaxy. The observatory where Selah worked floated high above the planet. Its sensors pointed outward toward the endless dark between stars. And it was here that she first noticed something strange. It started as a minor anomaly, a gravitational reading that did not match any known object, and she almost dismissed it as a sensor malfunction before something made her look closer. There was something out there in the deep black, something massive enough to bend light around itself. And yet there was nothing visible on any of her instruments. She ran the calculations 3 times before she was certain. And then she took her findings to her supervisor, an elderly Kelani named Torvin, who had spent 60 years studying the stars. "There is nothing there," he said after a brief glance at her data, his voice dismissive and tired. "But the gravitational readings clearly show." "Sensor malfunction," he interrupted. waving one clawed hand as though brushing away an annoying insect. The equipment is old and the calibrations are off. And I do not have time for phantom readings from a junior astronomer who should be focusing on her assigned projects. Sayla wanted to argue, but she knew it would do no good. And so she returned to her station and continued to watch the anomaly in secret. Days passed, and then weeks. And the shadow in the deep remained constant, unmoving. As though we were waiting for something, she began to notice other anomalies. Smaller gravitational disturbances scattered across the sector like seeds planted in dark soil. And each time she reported them, her concerns were dismissed. "You are seeing ghosts," Torvin told her during their last conversation on the subject, his voice carrying a warning that she understood all too well. "The humans are dead and gone. And whatever you think you are detecting is nothing more than your own imagination running wild." But Sayla could not stop watching, and she could not shake the feeling that the darkness between stars was not as empty as everyone believed, far from Nexus Prime, far from Paramount, far from any world that the hegemony had ever touched. Something vast moved through the void with perfect silence. It had no running lights, no energy signature, no presence that any sensor could detect. And it slid through the black like a predator stalking prey that did not yet know it was being hunted on its hull, barely visible in the faint light of distant stars. Letters spelled out a name in a language that the galaxy had tried to forget. You, Ashes, remembrance, and behind it, hidden in the dark between galaxies where no one had thought to look, thousands more waited for the signal that would end 3 centuries of patient silence. The galaxy slept peacefully that night, secure in the belief that its greatest sin was safely buried in the past, and it did not know that the dead were about to wake up. Captain Miriam Chun stood on the bridge of the UHS Remembrance and watched the stars drift past on the main view screen. Her hands clasped behind her back and her face as still as carved stone. She was 63 years old, born in the cold metal corridors of the Exodus fleet. And she had never breathed air that had not been recycled through machines or felt sunlight that had not been filtered through layers of radiation shielding. Her grandmother had been 12 years old when Soul burned, one of the 4 million who had escaped the genocide, while 12 billion others died screaming in the fire. The old woman had lived to be 97, and she had spent every day of those years making sure that her children and grandchildren never forgot what had been taken from them. "Status report," Chun said, her voice quiet but carrying easily across the silent bridge. "All systems operating at optimal capacity," her first officer replied. A tall man named David Okonke, whose family had served aboard the Remembrance since its construction. "The fleet remains in formation, and we are receiving confirmation signals from all 7,000 vessels, 7,000 warships, each one built in secret over 300 years of exile, each one carrying weapons and technology that the hegemony could not begin to understand when humanity had fled into the void between galaxies. They had taken everything they could carry and destroyed everything they could not. And they had left nothing behind for their murderers to study or learn from. The journey had taken 40 years. 40 years of drifting through absolute darkness with nothing but the fading light of the galaxy behind them. And many had died along the way from despair and sickness and the simple weight of loss. But those who survived had found something in the empty space between galaxies. Something that changed everything. Dead stars, round dwarfs that had never ignited. Rogue planets cast out from their home systems billions of years ago. And in that cosmic graveyard, humanity had found the resources to build an empire in secret. They had harvested the corpses of failed suns for fuel and metal. And they had constructed shipyards in the absolute darkness where no telescope could ever find them. And they had waited 300 years of waiting, 300 years of building, 300 years of teaching each new generation what had been done to their ancestors and what they would one day Return to Do in response, Jen had been raised on stories of Earth, a world she had never seen and could barely imagine. And she had trained her entire life for this moment. "Ma'am," the communications officer said, her voice tense with controlled excitement, "we have confirmation from reconnaissance. And there is a hegemony slave convoy passing through Sector 774. Chung closed her eyes for a moment, and in the darkness behind her eyelids she saw the face of her grandmother. Old and tired and burning with a fury that had never faded, the convoy was carrying members of species that the hegemony had conquered since humanity's supposed extinction. Beings taken from their homes and families to serve the 12 as laborers and servants, and worse, the hegemony had not stopped with humanity. And in the 3 centuries since the Purge of Soul, they had expanded their cruelty to encompass dozens of other species who had been too weak to resist. "How many ships in the convoy?" Chun asked. 12 transport vessels and 4 escort frigates," came the reply. "Approximately 8,000 slaves aboard, based on standard cargo configurations." 8,000 lives, Chen thought. 8,000 people who had done nothing wrong except be born to species that the hegemony considered inferior. She thought of her grandmother again, of the stories the old woman had told about the final days of the moon colonies, of the desperate scramble to evacuate as many people as possible. While hegemony warships moved into position around Sol, they had known what was coming, and they had been powerless to stop it. And the last transmission from Earth had been a single word repeated over and over again until the signal went dead. "Remember," Chun said, opening her eyes and staring at the view screen with an expression that made her bridge crew shiver. "Set intercept course for the convoy." Course laid in. "Ma'am, communications. Prepare a galaxy-wide broadcast on all frequencies, and make sure every species with a receiver can hear what we are about to say. Ready on your command." "Captain." Chun took a deep breath and felt the weight of 300 years pressing down on her shoulders. The accumulated grief and rage and desperate hope of every human who had lived and died in exile. They had spent so long preparing for this moment, so long training and building and planning, and now it was finally here. "All hands," she said, her voice carrying through every corridor and chamber of the 5-kilometer warship. "This is the captain speaking, and I want every member of this crew to understand what we are about to do." She paused, gathering her thoughts, knowing that her words would be recorded and studied by historians for centuries to come. 300 years ago, the hegemony of 12 murdered our people and tried to erase us from existence, and they thought they had succeeded. And they have spent 3 centuries celebrating our deaths while we built ourselves into something they cannot comprehend. The bridge was absolutely silent. Every officer frozen in place, every eye fixed on their captain. "We are not here for revenge," Chan continued. "Revenge would mean becoming what they are, and we will not give them the satisfaction of proving that they were right about us." She straightened her spine and lifted her chin. And in that moment, she looked like the embodiment of human defiance itself. "We are here for justice, and we are here to show the galaxy what humanity truly is. And we are here to make sure that what was done to us is never done to anyone else." She turned to face the main view screen, where the distant lights of the convoy were now visible to the naked eye. "Tactical. Prepare to decloak on my command." "Ready, Captain." "Communications. Are we broadcasting galaxy-wide all frequencies?" "Full encryption bypass." Chen allowed herself a small smile, the first expression of emotion she had shown since the operation began. "Then let us introduce ourselves." She raised one hand and held it steady for a single heartbeat. Decloak, the stealth field that had hidden the remembrance for 3 centuries, shimmered and fell away. And suddenly, the largest warship ever constructed by any species in galactic history was visible to everyone with eyes to see. 5 kilometers of angular black metal emerged from nothing, bristling with weapons that had no names in any hegemony language. And it hung in space like a monument to everything that the 12 had tried to destroy on the bridge of the lead escort frigate. A colony captain stared at his view screen and felt his heart stop beating. The ghost ship loomed before him, impossible and undeniable, and the word that escaped his lips was barely more than a whisper: humans. The distress signal from the convoy reached Hegemony Command on Paramount in less than 3 minutes. Traveling through relay stations that had been built specifically to ensure rapid communication across the vast distances of controlled space. Admiral Krixnar of the Velthari Supremacy was the ranking military officer on duty when the message arrived, and he listened to the panic transmission with growing disbelief. "This is Convoy 774 requesting immediate assistance." The voice of the colony captain screamed through the speakers. "We are under attack by unknown hostile vessel of impossible size and configuration, and the attackers are broadcasting identification codes that claim to be human." Krixnar felt his forearms go cold. A physical reaction he had not experienced since his first combat engagement over 60 years ago. "That is impossible," he said to no one in particular. "The humans were exterminated 3 centuries ago, and there is no possible way." The transmission cut off abruptly and was replaced by a new voice, calm and clear, and speaking in perfect galactic standard with an accent that no living being in the hegemony had heard in 300 years. "Attention, hegemony of 12. The human voice said. "This is Captain Miriam Chun of the United Human Ship Remembrance, and I am broadcasting this message on all frequencies so that every species in this galaxy can hear what I am about to say." Krixnar stumbled backward and knocked over his command chair. And across the galaxy, billions of beings stopped what they were doing to listen to the ghost that was speaking to them. 300 years ago. "Your ancestors made a choice," the captain continued, her voice steady and cold. "They looked at humanity and saw a threat that needed to be eliminated. And they gathered their fleets and came to our home system. And they murdered 12 billion innocent people on Nexus Prime." Sayla stood in the observation deck of the orbital station and stared at a view screen that showed the image of a human woman with dark hair and darker eyes. "You called it a cleansing," the captain said. "You called it a necessary action for the safety of the galaxy. And you have celebrated our extinction every year since, as though genocide was something to be proud of." The young astronomer felt tears running down her scales. "Though she could not have explained why you were wrong about us," Captain Chun declared. "You thought we were monsters who needed to be destroyed. But we were simply a young species trying to find our place among the stars. And you killed us for having the audacity to dream." The image on the screen shifted to show the convoy. The 4 escort frigates drifting powerless with their weapon systems disabled, and the 12 transport vessels opening their cargo bays under the direction of human soldiers who moved among the freed slaves with medical supplies and food. "We did not come here for revenge," the captain said as the image returned to her face. "Revenge would mean becoming what you are. And we refuse to dishonor our dead by transforming ourselves into their murderers on Paramount." The Hegemony Council had gathered in emergency session, and Ambassador Verthax was screaming at Admiral Krixnar to do something while the military commander stood frozen in shock. "We came here for justice," Captain Chun continued. "And we came here to deliver a message to the galaxy that needs to be heard." She leaned forward, and even across the vast distances of space, it felt as though she was looking directly into the eyes of every being who watched 300 years ago. The Hegemony of 12 voted unanimously to exterminate humanity, and we have the records of that vote. And we know the names of every species, every world, every official and commander and politician who participated in our genocide. The Hegemony Council chamber exploded in the chaos. representatives shouting over each other in a dozen languages while security forces rushed to and from exits that led nowhere safe. "This is not a declaration of war," the captain said, a voice cutting through the noise like a blade. "That declaration was made 3 centuries ago when you struck first. And this is simply notification that we have finally come to answer." She paused, and when she spoke again, there was something almost gentle in her voice. "To the species who were not part of the hegemony during the Purge of Soul, and to the conquered peoples who have suffered under hegemony rule since our supposed extinction, you have nothing to fear from humanity, and we remember what it was like to be helpless. And we will not become what we despise." The transmission ended, and for a long moment there was silence across the galaxy as billions of beings tried to process what they had just witnessed. Then the reports started coming in on Nexus Prime. Sayla ran to her instruments and began scanning the sector. And what she found made her scales turn pale. The gravitational anomalies she had been tracking for weeks were all moving now, converging on a single point in space. And as she watched, they began to appear one by one. Human warships emerged from their cloaking fields, each one as massive and terrible as the first. And they formed up in perfect formation around the hegemony patrol fleet that had been dispatched to investigate the convoy attack. There were 50 of them, then 100, then 200. And still they kept appearing. Admiral Krixnar stared at his tactical display and felt his mind trying to reject what his eyes were telling him. "How is this possible?" he whispered. "How could they have built so many ships without anyone detecting them?" "They had 300 years," one of his officers replied, his voice hollow with shock. 300 years to prepare while we did nothing but celebrate. The Hegemony Patrol Fleet, one of the largest military formations in the known galaxy with over 1,200 vessels, was surrounded by human warships that outnumbered them nearly 3 to 1. And then the humans broadcast their final message of the day. "Hegemony forces. This is Captain Chun," the human commander said. "You have one opportunity to surrender your weapons and submit to inspection. And if you comply, no harm will come to you or your crews." She paused, and when she continued, her voice was hard as the void itself. "If you do not comply, we will demonstrate exactly what 3 centuries of exile taught us about the art of war. And I strongly suggest you make the correct choice." On Nexus Prime, Sayla watched the standoff with her hearts pounding in her chest, and she found herself hoping desperately that the hegemony commanders would have the wisdom to surrender. She had seen the size of those human ships, had calculated their mass, and extrapolated their power requirements. And she understood something that the politicians and admirals did not. The humans were not bluffing, and they were not showing the galaxy their full strength. And what she was seeing was merely the first wave of something far larger, somewhere out there in the darkness. Thousands more ships were waiting for the signal to decloak, and Sayla knew with absolute certainty that the galaxy would never be the same again. Admiral Krixnar had served the Velthari supremacy for over 60 years, and he had never retreated from any enemy. And he was not about to submit to a species that should have been dead and forgotten. "All ships, open fire," he commanded, his forearms working the controls of his flagship with practiced precision. "Target the lead vessel and destroy it." 1,200 warships unleashed their weapons simultaneously, and the space between the two fleets blazed with energy beams and missile trails and the distinctive purple glow of hegemony plasma cannons. The barrage struck the Remembrance directly, enough firepower to crack a small moon. And Admiral Krixnar allowed himself a moment of savage satisfaction as he watched the impacts light up his tactical display. Then the satisfaction died in his throat. The human dreadnought was still there, its hull flickering with strange patterns as the energy from the attack was absorbed and redistributed through systems that hegemony scientists could not have imagined. Impossible. Krixnar breathed. That should have destroyed them 10 times over, on the Bridge of the Remembrance. Captain Chun watched the attack wash over her ship like water over stone, and she felt a cold sadness settle into her chest. She had hoped they would surrender, had hoped that 3 centuries might have taught the hegemony something about mercy and wisdom. But they had learned nothing. All ships, she said quietly, return fire. The human fleet responded as a single entity, 3,000 warships firing in perfect synchronization. And the hegemony formation simply ceased to exist. It was not a battle, and it was not even a massacre. And Captain Chun did not know what word could describe the systematic elimination of 1,200 enemy vessels in 11 minutes when it was over. The human fleet moved through the wreckage, and search and rescue teams were deployed to pick up survivors from escape pods and disabled ships. We will treat them as prisoners of war under human conventions, Chun ordered. Medical attention for the wounded and proper facilities for the rest until they can be processed. Her crew followed orders without question, and within hours over 40,000 hegemony personnel had been recovered from the debris field and were being cared for aboard human vessels on Paramount. The Hegemony Council watched the destruction of their patrol fleet in stunned silence. And for the first time in 300 years, they understood what it felt like to be powerless. Ambassador Verthax was the first to speak, his voice shaking with fear that he could not quite disguise as anger. We must respond with overwhelming force, he declared. Summon the combined fleets of all 12 species and crush these human vermin once and for all. With what? Admiral Krixnar replied through the communication link, his own ship having been one of the few to survive the engagement. You saw what they did to us, and their weapons are beyond anything we possess. Then we will build new weapons, Verthax insisted. We will develop new technologies, and we will. They had 300 years to prepare, the Admiral interrupted. 300 years while we grew soft and complacent and convinced ourselves that we were safe. And you want to start an arms race with people who have spent 3 centuries doing nothing but preparing for war. The council chamber fell silent. And in that silence, a new transmission arrived. It was Captain Chun again, her face calm and her voice steady. And she looked directly into the camera, as though she could see every council member watching. Members of the Hegemony Council. She began, I want you to understand something about humanity that you clearly did not comprehend 300 years ago. She paused. And when she continued, there was something almost gentle in her voice. We spent 3 centuries deciding what kind of species we would become. And every day of those 300 years we faced a choice between vengeance and justice. And every day we chose justice on Nexus Prime. Sayla watched the transmission along with billions of others, and she felt something tight in her chest begin to loosen. You chose obliteration for us, the captain continued. You decided that we did not deserve to exist, and you murdered 12 billion innocent people because you were afraid of what we might become. Her eyes hardened, but her voice remained controlled. We will not make the same choice. And we do not seek the extinction of any species. And we will not prove you right about us by becoming the monsters you claimed we were. Ambassador Verthax leaned forward, something like hope flickering in his eyes, and several other council members began to whisper among themselves. However, Captain Chun said, and a single word cut through the rising murmurs like a knife. Justice must be served. And the beings who ordered and executed the purge of soul must answer for their crimes. A list began scrolling across the screen. Thousands of names from all 12 hegemony species, each one accompanied by their role in the genocide. These are the war criminals, Chun explained. The commanders who gave the orders, the politicians who voted for extermination, the officials who coordinated the logistics of murder, and the descendants who have continued to celebrate our deaths. She met the camera with eyes that held 300 years of grief. Surrender these individuals to human custody for trial under galactic law, and there will be peace, and refuse, and we will come to collect them ourselves. The transmission ended, and the Hegemony Council erupted into chaos once more. Some representatives argued for immediate compliance, recognizing that they had no military option remaining, while others screamed about honor and dignity and refusing to bow to human demands. Ambassador Vothax was among the loudest voices calling for resistance, and Sayla watched his face on her view screen and understood why his name was on the list, as were the names of his father and grandfather and great-grandmother, a family line that had built its political power on the celebration of human extinction. They cannot be allowed to dictate terms to the hegemony, Vothax shouted. We are the dominant powers of this galaxy, and we will not submit to the judgment of a species we rightfully eliminated. But even as he spoke, reports were flooding in from across hegemony space. Human ships were decloaking everywhere, appearing above worlds that had never seen a human vessel, and they were not attacking. And they were broadcasting messages of support to the conquered species who lived under hegemony rule on Nexus Prime. A human diplomat appeared in the main plaza and began distributing food and medical supplies to the non-hegemony species who made up most of the world's working class. You are not our enemies, the diplomat said, and you have nothing to fear from us. And if you have been oppressed by the hegemony, we are here to help. Sayla watched the scene unfold from her observation post, as she realized that the humans had planned this moment for 3 centuries, and they had planned not just for war, but for what would come after. They were not conquerors, they were liberators. And as she watched the hegemony's grip on power begin to crack and crumble, she understood that the galaxy was about to change in ways that no one could have predicted. The humans had returned, and they had not come to destroy, they had come to judge. 6 months had passed since the Remembrance first decloaked above that slave convoy, and the galaxy had transformed in ways that historians would study for millennia to come. The hegemony of 12 no longer existed. 8 of the founding species had chosen to surrender peacefully, turning over their war criminals to human tribunals and accepting new terms of governance that stripped away their power over conquered peoples. The trials had been broadcast across the galaxy, and billions had watched as commanders and politicians and officials were held accountable for the purge of soul and the centuries of oppression that followed. Justice was delivered not through execution or torture, but through imprisonment and public acknowledgement of crimes. And the humans made sure that every species in the galaxy understood exactly what the hegemony had done and why it could never be allowed to happen again. 4 species had refused to surrender, the Kelani Dominion and Velthari supremacy among them, and Ambassador Varthax had rallied them into a final desperate alliance against the human fleet. The war had lasted 3 weeks. Human warships had systematically dismantled every military installation, every weapons factory, every shipyard and defense platform that the resistance possessed. And they had done so without harming a single civilian. We do not make war on innocents, Captain Chun had declared in her final broadcast to the resistance worlds. Your leaders chose this path, and your military followed them. But your children and your families and your workers did not make that choice. When it was over, the 4 resistant species found themselves powerless but alive. Their military capacity reduced to nothing, while their civilian infrastructure remained intact. Verthax himself was captured trying to flee to the Outer Rim, and he now awaited trial alongside thousands of others who had refused to accept that the galaxy no longer belonged to the 12. Sayla stood in the observation lounge of the Remembrance, still not quite believing that she was here, and she watched the stars drift past the massive windows while Captain Chun stood beside her. The human commander had invited her aboard as part of a diplomatic exchange program. one of many initiatives designed to build bridges between humanity and the species that had been caught in the middle of the conflict. "I have a question," Sayla said. Her voice soft in the quiet of the lounge. Chun nodded, her eyes still fixed on the stars. "Ask. After everything that was done to your people," the young astronomer said carefully. "After 300 years of exile and grief and anger, how did you not become monsters?" It was the question that had haunted Sayla since the day she first heard Captain Chun's voice on that galaxy-wide broadcast. And she needed to understand the answer. Chun was silent for a long moment, and when she finally spoke, her voice was heavy with a weight that Sayla could only imagine. "Some days." "We almost did." She turned to face the Kelani woman, and there was something ancient and tired in her dark eyes. "There were factions among us who wanted exactly what you feared," Chun admitted. "People who argued that we should repay genocide with genocide and burn every hegemony world until nothing remained but ash and memory." Sayla shivered at the image, knowing how close that nightmare had come to reality. "What stopped them?" she asked. "My grandmother," Chun replied, and a small smile crossed her face for the first time since Sayla had met her. She was 12 years old when Seoul burned, and she lived to be 97, and she spent every day of those years making sure we never forgot what was done to us. The captain walked to the window and placed one hand against the cold glass. "But she also made sure we never forgot who we were before the purge. And she used to tell me that the best revenge was not to prove the hegemony right about us, but to prove them wrong." She turned back to Sayla, and her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "They said we were dangerous because we were savage, and so we decided to be dangerous because we were just. And they said we were a threat because we were cruel, and so we decided to be a threat because we were merciful." Sayla felt her own tears beginning to fall, running down her scales in thin silver trails. "They wanted to destroy us because they feared what we might become," Chun continued. "And in the end, we became exactly what they feared, but also something they never expected." She smiled again, and this time it reached her eyes. "We became the protectors of the powerless and the judges of the guilty, and the proof that suffering does not have to make you cruel." Later that day, Sayla was given a tour of the memorial deck, a vast hall that stretched for nearly a kilometer through the heart of the remembrance. The walls were covered with names, billions of names carved into black stone, and each one represented a human life lost during the purge of Seoul. She walked through the hall in silence, reading names that meant nothing to her, but everything to the people who walked beside her. And she understood for the first time the true weight of what had been done 3 centuries ago. Near the end of the hall, she found a small alcove where fresh flowers had been placed before a section of wall, bearing a single family name. Chun. Captain Chun stood before the alcove with her head bowed, and Sayla realized that she was looking at the names of everyone the captain's family had lost. Parents and siblings and cousins and aunts and uncles. An entire lineage reduced to carved letters on a wall. "I come here every day," Chun said without looking up, "to remind myself why we did this and why we had to do it the right way." Sayla stood beside her in respectful silence, and for a long moment they simply existed together in that space of grief and memory. "What happens now?" the young astronomer finally asked. Chun straightened and wiped her eyes with the back of one hand. "Now we rebuild," she said. "Earth has been re-terraformed and the first colonists landed yesterday. And for the first time in 300 years, humans are walking on the soil of our ancestral home." She smiled, and there was genuine joy in the expression. "Would you like to see it?" An hour later, Sayla stood on the observation deck of a shuttle descending through the atmosphere of Earth, and she watched as blue oceans and green continents appeared through the clouds below. The world was beautiful in a way she had never experienced. alive and vibrant and full of a promise that made her heart's ache beside her. Captain Chun watched the descent with tears streaming freely down her face. And she was not the only human aboard who wept. "My grandmother never stopped believing we would come home," Chun whispered. "She died 10 years before we launched the first reconnaissance missions. But she never lost faith." The shuttle touched down in a field of grass that swayed in a warm breeze. And the humans aboard rushed down the ramp to kneel and touch the soil of a world their families had not seen 3 centuries. Captain Chun was the last to descend, and she stood at the top of the ramp for a long moment, simply breathing the air. Then she stepped forward and pressed her palm against the ground. And she closed her eyes, and she spoke a single word: "Remember." Sayla watched from the shuttle doorway, and she understood that this moment was not just about homecoming. It was about the completion of a promise made by the dying to those who would survive. A promise that had been kept through 300 years of exile and grief and patient preparation. The humans had not forgotten, and they had not become monsters. And they had returned to claim what had been taken from them while proving to the galaxy that justice was possible, even after the greatest of crimes. The hegemony had called humanity a disease to be purged. But they had been wrong. Humanity was not a disease. Humanity was the cure. And as Captain Miriam, Chun stood on the soil of Earth with her face turned toward the sun. The long night finally ended, and a new dawn began to break across a galaxy that would never be the same again.